The sun rose over Monterrey in 2019, casting a golden hue over the quiet neighborhood where Javier García and his family lived. To outsiders, their lives seemed ordinary, even idyllic. Javier, a 38-year-old mechanic, worked tirelessly in his small garage to provide for his wife, Isabel Torres, and their two daughters, Lucía and Mariana. Life was simple, though not without its challenges. Javier's days were filled with fixing engines, the smell of oil and grease embedded in his work clothes, while Isabel managed the home and occasionally visited her friends. Javier's dedication to his family was evident in the long hours he spent at the garage, ensuring that his daughters never lacked anything. His pride in being a father and husband gave him purpose, even if it left him physically and emotionally drained by the end of the day. Despite his sacrifices, cracks had begun to form in their marriage, small, almost imperceptible shifts in Isabel's demeanor. Javier, ever hopeful, dismissed these changes as temporary. Isabel, however, was restless. The predictability of her life had begun to suffocate her. Each day felt like a repeat of the last, and she longed for something more, something exciting. Her clients at the upscale salon she frequented often spoke of their glamorous lifestyles, their elegant clothes, their exotic vacations. She couldn't help but compare their lives to her own, and the dissatisfaction grew. It wasn't that she didn't love Javier, it was that she wanted more than he could offer. It was during one of these visits to the salon that Isabel met Samuel Diaz, a wealthy and charismatic car dealer. Samuel was everything Javier wasn't: confident, well-dressed, and effortlessly charming. He noticed Isabel's beauty immediately and struck up a conversation. What began as polite banter quickly deepened into something more. Samuel offered her a glimpse into the world she craved, a life of luxury and excitement. Isabel found herself drawn to him, despite the nagging guilt that whispered in the back of her mind. As the days turned into weeks, their relationship evolved. Isabel began making excuses to leave home more often. Trips to the market took hours, and she started dressing more elegantly, her appearance suddenly polished and deliberate. Javier didn't go unnoticed by those around her. Javier noticed her growing distance, but didn't confront her. He believed in giving her space, convinced that their marriage could withstand whatever turbulence they faced. It was Alejandra Cruz, Isabel's best friend, who first voiced her concerns. Over coffee one afternoon, Alejandra bluntly asked Isabel about her behavior. "You're playing with fire," Alejandra warned. "Think about Javier and the girls." But Isabel brushed her off, insisting that Alejandra didn't understand. For Isabel, the affair wasn't just about Samuel. It was about feeling alive again. Her excuses became habitual, and her guilt faded into the background, replaced by the thrill of her double life. Back at home, Javier remained oblivious to the full extent of her betrayal, though unease began to creep into his thoughts. He dismissed the occasional rumors from neighbors and reassured himself that Isabel would never do anything to hurt their family. But deep down, doubt lingered like a shadow in his mind. The turning point came when Alejandra, unable to hold back any longer, told Javier what she suspected. "Javier, I need to tell you something," she said hesitantly one evening as he worked in his garage. Her words were like a hammer to his chest, each one a blow harder than the last. Javier didn't believe it at first. He couldn't. But Alejandra's sincerity planted a seed of suspicion that refused to be ignored. Later that week, Javier decided to confirm the truth for himself. He followed Isabel one evening after she said she was meeting friends. His heart raced. As he trailed her car through the streets of Monterrey, his palms slick with sweat. She parked outside a sleek modern house, the kind of place they could never afford, and rang the doorbell. Samuel greeted her, his hand resting on her waist as they disappeared inside. Javier sat in his car, frozen. The sight of his wife in another man's arms was a blow unlike anything he had ever experienced. Betrayal burned through his veins, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. His world, the life he had worked so hard to build, was crumbling before his eyes. As the minutes passed, Javier's shock turned to anger. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, and stared at the house. His thoughts were a storm of pain, rage, and confusion. How could Isabel do this to him? To their daughters? He drove away, his mind a blur, seeking solace in the one place that felt familiar: his garage. It was there, surrounded by the tools of his trade, that he began to unravel. His co-worker Martín López noticed something was wrong. "Javier, are you okay?" he asked cautiously. But Javier couldn't bring himself to speak of the betrayal. Instead, he buried his head in his hands, silent tears staining the workbench. What had started as a quiet unease had grown into a tidal wave of emotions that threatened to consume him. As the night wore on, Javier sat alone in the garage, his thoughts spiraling. He couldn't shake the image of Isabel and Samuel together, the betrayal replaying in his mind like a haunting melody. And as the hours ticked by, his sadness began to morph into something far more dangerous: rage. The night after discovering Isabel's betrayal stretched endlessly for Javier García. The darkness of his garage became a mirror to the darkness consuming his soul. Every shadow seemed to whisper accusations. Every creak of the metal tools echoed his anger. The image of Isabel in Samuel's arms replayed in his mind like a cruel, inescapable film. Each frame tightened the grip of rage on his heart, replacing the love he once held for his wife with something far more destructive. For the first time, Javier found it impossible to sleep. He left the house before dawn, unable to face Isabel without the truth boiling to the surface. Instead, he sought refuge at his garage. Javier's co-worker and confidant, Martín López, arrived early that morning and immediately sensed something was wrong. Javier, usually calm and steady, was pacing like a caged animal. "Javier, you're not yourself. What's going on?" Martín asked gently, setting down his coffee cup.
Javier hesitated, his jaw clenched as he struggled to find words. Finally, he muttered, "She's been lying to me. Isabel. She's with someone else." Martín's eyes widened with shock. "Are you sure?" he asked cautiously. Javier nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he recounted what he had witnessed. Martín listened in silence, his expression shifting between sympathy and concern. "Listen, Javier," Martín said after a long pause. "I know this feels like the end of the world, but you need to keep your head straight. Think of your daughters. Don't let this consume you." Javier nodded absent-mindedly, but Martín's words barely registered. His thoughts were already spiraling into dangerous territory. Javier's mind raced with questions. Why had Isabel done this? Was it because he wasn't good enough? Had his sacrifices meant nothing to her? The love he once felt for her was now tainted by bitterness and humiliation. That evening, Javier returned home, hoping to confront Isabel. As he stepped through the door, he was greeted by the usual chaos of his daughters playing in the living room. Isabel was in the kitchen, her back turned to him as she prepared dinner. She looked so normal, so serene, as though nothing had happened. The sight of her, so composed, ignited a new wave of fury in Javier. How could she pretend everything was fine after what she had done? But when he opened his mouth to speak, the words caught in his throat. He looked at his daughters, who were laughing and chasing each other around the room, oblivious to the storm brewing in their father's heart. The confrontation would have to wait. For their sake, Javier swallowed his anger and played along with the facade of normalcy. Days turned into weeks, and Javier's torment only grew. Isabel continued her affair with Samuel, oblivious to the fact that Javier knew. She came home late more frequently, offering flimsy excuses that Javier didn't bother to challenge. Each lie was another wound, deepening the chasm between them. Javier's behavior didn't escape Isabel's notice. He had grown quieter, more withdrawn, and his usual warmth toward her had vanished. At first, she thought it was just work stress, but as the days passed, she began to suspect that he knew something. Despite this, she chose not to address it, fearing the confrontation she knew was inevitable. One fateful evening, Javier decided he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to see it for himself again, not because he doubted the affair, but because he needed to fuel his resolve. He followed Isabel once more, this time parking his car a block away from Samuel's house. He watched as she entered, laughing and smiling, her hand brushing Samuel's arm. The sight sent a cold shiver down Javier's spine. He clenched his fists so tightly that his nails dug into his palms, drawing blood. As the hours dragged on, Javier remained in his car, staring at the house. Lights flickered on and off inside, shadows moved behind the curtains, and Javier's imagination filled in the blanks with tormenting detail. Each moment felt like an eternity, the weight of his rage pressing down on him until he could hardly breathe. By the time Isabel emerged and drove away, Javier was no longer the man he had been. Something inside him had snapped, a delicate thread of self-control that had kept his darker impulses at bay. He didn't follow Isabel home. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the city, his mind consumed by a single, overpowering thought: justice. The drive eventually brought him back to his garage, his sanctuary, and now his prison. The tools he had used for years to build and repair cars now seemed to call out to him with a sinister allure. His eyes settled on a heavy mallet, its worn handle resting against the workbench. He picked it up, feeling its weight in his hand, the rough texture of the wood against his palm. It was a tool meant for creation, but in his hands, it promised destruction. Javier sat with the mallet for hours, his mind racing through a whirlwind of emotions. Sadness, betrayal, anger, and despair collided, each one feeding the other until they became indistinguishable. The mallet was no longer just a tool, it was a symbol of the power he had lost, the control he yearned to regain. The next evening, Javier's breaking point finally arrived. Isabel left again, using the same tired excuse of meeting friends. This time, Javier didn't follow her. He already knew where she was going. Instead, he waited until nightfall, the mallet hidden beneath his jacket as he walked the dimly lit streets toward Samuel's house. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive as Javier approached the sleek, modern house. He hesitated at the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the point of no return. A small, fleeting voice in the back of his mind begged him to turn around, to go home and leave the past behind. But the voice was drowned out by the roar of his anger. The door was unlocked. Javier pushed it open slowly, his movements deliberate and calculated. Inside, the house was dimly lit, the soft hum of a television the only sound. He stepped into the living room and froze. There they were, Isabel and Samuel, seated together on the couch, their bodies close, their laughter mingling in the air. They didn't notice him at first, too absorbed in their own world to sense the presence of the man whose life they had shattered. But when Javier stepped forward, his shadow falling across the room, their laughter stopped abruptly. Isabel turned, her eyes widening in shock and terror as she saw the mallet in his hand. "Javier, wait," she began, but her words were cut off by the sound of his footsteps, heavy and deliberate, as he crossed the room. Javier's steps echoed in the quiet room, each one amplifying the tension in the air. Isabel froze, her body rigid with fear, while Samuel, initially confused, rose to his feet. The mallet in Javier's hand glinted under the faint light of the room, its purpose unmistakable. "Javier," Isabel stammered, her voice trembling. What are you doing here? He didn't respond. His eyes, dark and hollow, were locked on her, the woman he had loved, the mother of his children, the one who had betrayed him in the most profound way. Every word she had ever said to him, every promise, every moment of their life together, felt like a cruel joke in the face of her betrayal. Samuel, trying to mask his fear with bravado, stepped forward. "Listen, man, whatever you think is happening here," he began, but Javier cut him off with a single glare. The sheer intensity in Javier's eyes made Samuel take a step back, his confidence faltering. "This isn't about what I think," Javier said, his voice low and steady, though it trembled with barely contained rage. "It's about what I know. About what I've seen." Isabel's hands trembled as she reached out, as though to calm him. "Javier, please," she pleaded. "We can talk about this. Let's just talk." Javier spat, his voice rising. "You want to talk now? After everything? After you've lied to me, humiliated me, destroyed our family?" His voice cracked on the last words, the pain in his heart spilling out into the room. Isabel flinched, tears streaming down her face, but she said nothing. What could she say? Every word would only confirm her guilt. Javier turned his attention to Samuel. "And you," he said, his voice cold and venomous. "You couldn't find someone else? You had to ruin my life?" Samuel raised his hands defensively. "Look, man, I didn't know. Don't lie to me." Javier roared, his voice shaking the room. "You knew exactly what you were doing." The mallet felt heavy in his hand, its weight a physical manifestation of his anger. Samuel took another step back, his expression shifting from defiance to fear. Isabel tried to move between them, but Javier's fury was no longer something she could control. "Javier, please, think about Lucía and Mariana," Isabel said desperately. "They need their father." Her words struck a chord, a momentary flicker of hesitation crossing Javier's face. But it was fleeting. The image of Isabel and Samuel together, laughing, touching, shattered any rational thought. All Javier could see was betrayal, all he could feel was the weight of his anger pressing down on him. "You should have thought about them," Javier said, his voice chillingly calm now, "before you threw everything away." And then, in an instant, the mallet swung. The sound of it connecting with Samuel's skull was sickening, a dull, wet thud that echoed in the stillness of the room. Samuel crumpled to the floor, his body lifeless before it even hit the ground. Isabel screamed, a sound of pure horror and despair, but Javier wasn't done. He turned to her, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild. "You destroyed us," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You killed what we had long before I ever picked this up." Isabel backed away, her hands raised in a futile attempt to shield herself. "Javier, no," she sobbed. "Please, don't do this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Her apologies fell on deaf ears. Javier's pain and rage had consumed him entirely. He raised the mallet again, and the last thing Isabel saw was the man she once loved, his face twisted in anguish, before the world went dark. When the room finally fell silent, Javier stood amidst the carnage, the mallet slipping from his bloody hands and clattering to the floor. The sight before him, the bodies of Samuel and Isabel, their blood pooling beneath them, was surreal. His chest heaved as he struggled to process what he had done. The anger that had driven him to this point was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that threatened to swallow him whole. For a moment, Javier stood frozen, his mind blank. Then, the weight of his actions crashed down on him, and his knees buckled. He sank to the floor, his hands covering his face as he sobbed. This wasn't justice. This wasn't closure. This was destruction, pure and simple, and there was no undoing it. The hours that followed were a blur. Javier didn't remember leaving the house, but suddenly he found himself driving aimlessly through the city, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He didn't go home. He couldn't face his daughters, not after what he had done. Instead, he checked into a dingy motel on the outskirts of Monterrey, locking himself away from the world. Back at Samuel's house, the scene of the crime was discovered the next morning. The housekeeper arrived to find the bodies and immediately called the police. Detective Clara Mendez, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp intuition, was assigned to the case. As she surveyed the grisly scene, her mind began piecing together the narrative. The evidence was damning: the unlocked door, the mallet left at the scene, the blood trail leading outside. Clara knew this wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal. And it didn't take long for her to learn about the affair between Isabel and Samuel, a detail that pointed her squarely toward Javier García as the prime suspect. Neighbors were quick to provide testimony. Some had seen Javier's car parked outside Samuel's house late at night. Others spoke of the tension in the García household, the whispers of infidelity that had been circulating for weeks. And then there was Alejandra Cruz, Isabel's best friend, who confirmed Javier's growing suspicions and his emotional turmoil leading up to the murders. The police launched a citywide manhunt, but Javier had vanished. Days passed with no sign of him, and the case became a media sensation. The story of a betrayed husband driven to unspeakable violence captured the public's attention, sparking debates about morality, justice, and the devastating consequences of infidelity. On the third day, Javier was finally found. He had been holed up in the motel, unable to eat or sleep, the weight of his guilt crushing him. When the police burst into his room, he didn't resist. He sat on the edge of the bed, his face pale and drawn, and simply said, "I'll tell you everything." During his interrogation, Javier confessed to the murders, his voice hollow and emotionless. He spoke of his love for Isabel, his devastation at her betrayal, and the uncontrollable rage that had consumed him. But no amount of explanation could undo what had been done. As he was led away in handcuffs, Javier couldn't help but think of his daughters. Lucía and Mariana. How would they remember him? As a father who loved them, or as the man who tore their world apart? The thought was unbearable, but it was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. The defense, led by attorney Ricardo Herrera, presented a different narrative. They portrayed Javier as a man driven to the brink of madness by the betrayal of the two people he trusted most. Ricardo argued that the murders were crimes of passion, not premeditation. He highlighted Javier's emotional breakdown in the days leading up to the incident, calling it an eruption of suppressed pain and anguish rather than a calculated act of revenge. The trial of Javier García began in 2021, and it was the talk of Monterrey. The courtroom was packed each day, with journalists, neighbors, and curious onlookers eager to hear the details of the tragic case that had shaken the community. Javier, once a hard-working mechanic and devoted father, now sat in the defendant's chair, his face gaunt and expressionless. He seemed like a shadow of the man he had been, weighed down by the crushing reality of his actions. The prosecution painted a grim picture of the events leading to the murders. They argued that Javier's actions were premeditated, pointing to the mallet he had brought with him and the calculated way he had entered Samuel Diaz's home. The prosecutor, a sharp and determined woman named Adriana Morales, emphasized the brutality of the murders, describing them as an act of cold-blooded revenge. She spoke of Isabel and Samuel as victims of a man who let his rage consume him, turning him into a killer. Javier's testimony was the most anticipated part of the trial. When he took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. His voice was steady but tinged with regret as he recounted the events that led to that fateful night. He described the pain of discovering Isabel's affair, the heartbreak of seeing the woman he loved in another man's arms, and the rage that blinded him in the moments before the murders. "I wasn't thinking," Javier said, his voice cracking as he addressed the jury. "I wasn't myself. All I could feel was anger at them for what they'd done to me, to my family. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I couldn't stop myself. I lost control." As he spoke, tears filled his eyes. He looked at the gallery where his daughters, Lucía and Mariana, sat with Alejandra Cruz, their mother's best friend. Lucía, now 12, stared at him with a mixture of sadness and confusion, while Mariana, just 8, clung to Alejandra's arm, too young to fully grasp the magnitude of what was happening. Javier's heart broke at the sight of them. He had failed them in the worst way possible. The trial dragged on for weeks, with witnesses recounting the changes in Javier's demeanor, Isabel's affair with Samuel, and the events that unfolded on the night of the murders. The media sensationalized every detail, painting Javier as either a monster consumed by jealousy or a tragic figure undone by betrayal, depending on the outlet. In her closing arguments, Adriana Morales reminded the jury of the brutality of the crime. "What happened on that night wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment," she said. "It was an intentional act of violence, fueled by anger and a desire for revenge. Javier García may have been a victim of betrayal, but that doesn't excuse his actions. 2 lives were taken, and his daughters were left without a mother." Ricardo Herrera, on the other hand, pleaded for compassion. "Javier García is not a monster," he said. "He is a man who was pushed to his breaking point. This was not premeditated. This was the result of a man overwhelmed by emotions he could not control. He has already lost everything, his wife, his family, and his freedom. Punishing him further will not undo the pain that has been caused." After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty. Javier was convicted of second-degree murder, a decision that acknowledged his emotional state but also the severity of his actions. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a punishment that left the courtroom divided. Some felt it was too lenient, while others believed it was a fair acknowledgement of the complex circumstances surrounding the case. In the months that followed, the shock of the trial began to fade, but the aftermath of Javier's actions continued to ripple through the lives of those he left behind. Lucía and Mariana, now living with Alejandra, struggled to process the loss of their mother and the absence of their father. Alejandra did her best to provide a stable environment for the girls, but she couldn't shield them from the harsh realities of what had happened. Lucía, the older of the two, bore the weight of the situation more heavily. She remembered the arguments between her parents, the nights her father came home late, and the changes in her mother's behavior. She felt anger at her mother for the betrayal, sadness for her father's fate, and a deep, unshakable confusion about how her once loving family had fallen apart. Mariana, on the other hand, clung to the memories of happier times. She often asked Alejandra when her father would come home, not fully understanding the permanence of his absence. Alejandra, torn between protecting the girls and being honest, struggled to find the right words to explain. Javier, now serving his sentence, spent his days reflecting on his actions. The prison walls were cold and unyielding, but they couldn't compare to the prison of his own mind. He thought constantly of his daughters, the only remnants of the life he had destroyed. He wrote letters to them, pouring out his love and regret, though he wasn't sure if they would ever want to read them. In his darker moments, Javier wondered if he deserved forgiveness. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but he hoped, in time, that Lucía and Mariana might come to understand the man he had been before that night. He clung to the hope that one day, he might be able to rebuild even a fragment of the relationship he had lost with them. The tragedy of Javier García's story left an indelible mark on Monterrey. It sparked conversations about the devastating effects of betrayal, the consequences of unchecked emotions, and the importance of mental health and conflict resolution. For many, it was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly love can turn to anger and how anger, left unchecked, can destroy everything in its path. For Javier, the days in prison blended into one another, each one a painful reminder of the family he had lost and the irreversible decisions he had made. All he could do now was carry the weight of his actions and hope that, one day, the daughters he loved more than anything might find it in their hearts to forgive him.